Afternoon. Last week, I was away on a study leave and was reading material on ministries that were created out of nothing. Some of them were quite radical in nature. One in particular was about working with street kids, gangs in New York, and how this person just had a calling and followed that calling. What was interesting about the read is that this person had a relationship to God that was unmistakable, undeniable, and God seemed to speak clearly to him as he moved from step to step to step. Now, he did make mistakes, but even the mistakes in reading of the book anyway led inevitably to an increase in his ability to minister. It appeared that a theme that ran through some of the reading that I was doing was about listening to God, listening to the Spirit. Perhaps most importantly, being reassured by God that the path that was being taken was actually in line with what God wanted. It made me ask this question. And I put it out here this afternoon. How do we do this? How do we hear God? How do we open ourselves to the leading of the Spirit as opposed, say, to being led by a tradition or being led by someone's expectation or being led by our own fear or by our own pride? How do we know that we are in line with what God wants for us? And I think the question becomes important as we in our churches look at, putting bums in the pews or some new outreach program. How can we be reassured that God wants what we think we might want? In one of the books that I read, one of the ways that this person had listened to God was, it was called putting a fleece before the Lord. And it came out of the book of Judges. It is what Gideon did. Gideon was nervous about something God had asked him to do. He requested God to guarantee a victory through two tests. In the first test, Gideon puts a fleece on the ground and asks God to miraculously cause dew to fall, but only collect on the garment, not on the rest of the ground. And in the morning it was done. But Gideon still wasn't satisfied, and in the second test switched it up and asked that the fleece be dry and that the ground around it be wet. And the next morning, it was done. And so this gave the reassurance that Gideon needed to take the steps that inevitably led to victory. Now, I put that out not as a way for us to find reassurances, though it might work. For me it comes a little close to testing God, and I hesitate. But still, Gideon needed reassurances, and God patiently addressed that need. And I do believe that God is able to converse with us clearly, if only we can find a means to listen. It makes me imagine what it would be like to start a church council meeting by asking God to first show us a sign of what direction we ought to be going in. Put away the agenda. Wait for God. And I fear, as I imagine it, that we might be quite disappointed and go home without anything being done. And people would not necessarily come back to try it again, but I think would lose patience, particularly with me. And I think I would be back to an agenda before you could shake a stick. However, we can't be sure that God wouldn't answer. And it isn't not true that it's fear and impatience, perhaps, too, that is often a block for us to hear God clearly speak. Nonetheless, I want to say this. Before anything else, we must trust that God is with us. Before we make any decisions, we must ground ourselves in the will of God. Now, this doesn't answer, in fact, it raises the very question that I had asked earlier. How can we be reassured that we're actually hearing what God's will is and not our will? As leaders, how do we effectively communicate such a path? As followers, how do we remain faithful to a path like that? I mean, I think back to Moses, the Exodus story. How many times was Moses stuck? How many times did his people complain and lose themselves in fear? You know, throughout history, throughout Christendom, people have been claiming God's with them. People have been deaf to it, but others who've taken a chance have also not necessarily been rewarded. Because clearly, not only did God lead the way, but mistakes were made by men and women who tried to lead the way, whose voices should probably never have been listened to, because all they were power brokers. And they created situations that made things far worse. You know, when we take on the task of leading or following the will of God, we can really mess up. We need to acknowledge that in our ways we can make mistakes, and we run the risk of hurting others, or at the very least wasting resources. So this brings us back full circle. How do we open ourselves up to the leading of the Spirit, stay walking within the leading of the Spirit? I believe, as I'm experiencing that question, that the question itself is actually quite personal. And so are the answers, if there is to be an answer. Because we have, each of us, our unique way of listening to God. It's come through our history, our culture, and I suppose also our religious affiliation. You know, for example, in me as an Anglican, what has given the Anglican Church a sense of confidence that it's following the will of God? You know, what worked for Gideon may not be what works for us, but then again, it might be. I mean, have you ever tried it? It certainly leaves us thinking. And I know for myself, it would be quite a joy to have those kinds of signs of certainty and paths of clarity. I'd like to conclude with a passage that's important for me as I ponder and work through these issues. And it is this. It comes out of Romans chapter 8. All things work together for good to those that love God and are called according to his purpose, or her purpose. I believe that the best any of us can do is attempt in our own way to make God the center of all of our decisions. When we misstep, as long as we've been tried, or as long as we have tried to follow the will of God, when we misstep, we must allow God's forgiveness and learn to trust that all will be made well. Well, there's a lot I have said here, and some of it I know that it's quite confusing, and for myself as well. And I pray you on your journey will be successful in claiming to walk in the path of God.